Okay, so my wife called, which shut my phone off. So, oh my gosh, shut this door. Hey, Bug, have a nice time. Have a good time. Love you. Sorry, my daughter's going to soccer practice. So, back to Thomas Munzer. So Thomas Munzer, at this time, ever since the plague hit, you had reduction in peasants, right? I mean, the plague's hitting, it's killing between 30 and 70% of the population. And what happens is peasants in the 1300s are actually able to have a lot more freedom because there's less of them. So they have a greater freedom to go hunting, fishing, things of this nature. And over time, they start to lose some of these freedoms. So by the 1500s, you have princes that are like, you can't hunt in these woods. These are my woods to hunt in. You can't fish in this brook. This is my brook to fish in. And the peasants are annoyed because they have in their own history, they know that there was a time they could do this. So peasants are getting more and more frustrated. And you have small little peasant uprisings every once in a while. Well, in 1524, you have a major peasant revolt. And Thomas Munzer, and it piggybacks with the Reformation. So you can't say that Luther is responsible for the peasant revolt, but it helps. All right, people reading the Bible for themselves and looking at this saying, hey, you should follow what the Bible says and you shouldn't be so wealthy and you should give money to us. And that helps, but the unrest is already there. And Thomas Munzer comes in and he's like, look, as peasants, we have a right to all of this. These are the ungodly. These princes, fake Martin Luther. And it's funny because Luther just dismisses Thomas Munzer. And again, not making any comment here, pro or con, but Luther is like Donald Trump in the sense that Donald Trump can out-insult anybody, right? And when you insult Donald Trump, he just kind of brushes it off. Luther is fantastic at insulting people. Not that that's necessarily a good thing, but I mean, he's able to just smack down. And when people throw stuff back, it's like, whatever. So he just belittles Thomas Munzer, just irritated with him. And that bothers Thomas Munzer. So he's always writing against Luther. And he becomes a leader in this peasant revolt. And so it's interesting because at the same time, Karlstadt, the guy I've mentioned a few times, a theologian in Wittenberg, he leaves Wittenberg. He and Luther butt heads. And Karlstadt is on okay terms with Thomas Munzer. But he's not joining the peasant revolt. And Luther actually protects Karlstadt because he knows his life is in danger because of his ties with Munzer. He lets him stay in Wittenberg till things can clear up and then sends him on his way. Because again, they're not really on good terms. And theologically, I mentioned this earlier, Karlstadt goes from being Roman Catholic to Lutheran to Anabaptist to Reformed when he dies. So he does everything. So Munzer leads this peasant revolt. And during this peasant revolt, he says, look, God is with us. We're invincible. We're going to attack the armies of the princes. None of us are going to die. We're going to overthrow the ungodly, and then we're going to bring in this kind of like Christian socialist utopia. And so they have a Battle of Frankenhausen, I think May of 1924. It might be 25. I think it's 24. They have a battle. So you have all of these princes that are on horses with lances and swords, probably some muskets. And here you have peasants with pitchforks and torches and Thomas Munzer. How do you think it goes? That's right, you have thousands of peasants die. Thousands are slaughtered. 6 die from the prince's men. It is a slaughter. And before this, Luther says, look, princes, you need to have some grace with the peasants, right? You need to understand, go easy on them. Peasants, you need to understand that God has established his social order, and so you need to do your part as a peasant. You can't just overthrow stuff. You don't have a right to these things. So Luther is trying to bring about a kind of a peace here. And when the peasants are in various areas, they're like burning a monastery, beating up mayors of towns, like they're doing these things. And Luther goes, I've had it. And he writes one of his most infamous letters, which is against the murderous, thieving peasants. And I suggest get that and read it, all right? Or at least look up and find the most, the best parts, the most. He says nothing is worse than a peasant. A peasant is like a rabid dog that can only lead to violence and causes problems. Therefore, it's the duty of the princes to slay, smite, stab, and kill anywhere he can these murderous peasants. And the princes are like, okay. So he basically gives them permission to end this, and they do. And the peasants remember what Luther said, and it hurts Luther amongst a lot of the peasant class because they see him as selling them out, when really Luther was consistent. Luther never advocated for the peasants to do these things, and they just went too far, and he's like, no, I've had it. So in some sense, Thomas Müntzer is kind of like a proto-Anabaptist. He's actually in conversation with Conrad Grebel and Felix Manz in Zurich, who the two Anabaptists with Zwingli. They're talking with him, but they're not violent. Müntzer is. So going back to Zwingli in Zurich, Conrad Grebel, Felix Manz, George Blaurock are these three who are seen as the first real Anabaptists. And generally speaking, if we look at the Anabaptists, their theology, it's very hard to pin down because basically anybody who opposed infant baptism is thrown into the camp of Anabaptist. So you had some that were violent revolutionaries and some that were pacifists. For the most part, all right, and there's a few exceptions, for the most part, they believe that you should have a separation of church and state. And I tend to think that is just because they are on the outs, right? They are the ones being punished by the government, therefore we should separate from the government. I tend to think if the government supported them, they would have taken advantage of it. So I kind of think that that's just, they're pushed in that direction, and so they're against church and state together because they were on the wrong side of it. Balthasar Hubmaier actually is for some semblance of church and state. And then you're going to have the crazy Anabaptists in the 1530s who want to be the state, right? So, but for the most part, most Anabaptists believe in a separation of church and state. And therefore, what do? They live in Western Europe where the church and state are ever present. So the Anabaptists go and make their own communities. They are never legal. So you had to hope that you just didn't get found out, hope that people didn't care, or hope that you had a governor that would overlook it or kind of protect you. But they would just go have a community and they would get found and they would just get killed. So there's a great work called the Schleitheim, the Schleitheim Confession, and then the trial of Michael Sattler. Michael Sattler was a Catholic priest who became an Anabaptist, 1527, and he and fellow Anabaptists write what is called the Schleitheim Confession, which is the first clear listing of a group of Anabaptists and what they believe. They take the Sermon on the Mount very literally. So when it says to turn the other cheek, they interpret that to mean you have to be a pacifist. When it says don't take an oath, they mean you are never allowed to take an oath ever. So when you're not an Anabaptist and you say, hey, you're a pacifist, well, what are you going to do when the Turks attack? Like that, we're not going to have you here being pacifists. We're sitting here putting our lives on the line and you're just going to take advantage of that. Likewise, you're not going to take an oath. How are you going to, if you have to swear to the governing authorities, so they were seen as radicals. And because of that, they were just executed, right? By Catholics, Lutherans, and Reformed. Like everybody would kill the Anabaptists. So in the 1530s, 1536 or 1537, well, actually leading up to that, there's a guy named Melchior Hoffman. And Anabaptists, you would have some that came out of Catholic priests. A lot of them were just a common person. I'm a hat maker. Hey, wow, I heard the gospel preached. I believe I'm now a prophet. Sometimes they would say that. So Melchior Hoffman believes that that Christ is coming to return. And what he is going to do is the New Jerusalem is going to come down, and then we're going to be, here in the New Jerusalem, and everything's going to be great. And Melchior Hoffman says, but for this to happen, I have to get imprisoned. So he goes to Martin Bucer. Where's Martin Bucer? Strasbourg. And gets himself imprisoned. And then he says it's going to happen at a certain time. That time comes and goes. He goes, oh, I guess I was wrong. Yeah, you were wrong. But he had followers, and his followers said, the reason that the New Jerusalem didn't come down is because we didn't take any active role in bringing it about. Melchior Hoffman said it's just going to happen. But people like Bernard Rothman, people like John Van Leyden and Jan Matthys said, no, we have to take a part in this. And so what they did is they orchestrated over time a takeover of the city of Munster. And so in Munster, they had a town council, and Anabaptists, they said, this is where the New Jerusalem is coming. So Anabaptists from all over Germany and the Netherlands came to Munster, and they eventually became the majority. So then they got on the town council and were like, boom, here's what we're going to do. We're having an Anabaptist utopia right here in Munster. And so the guy who was in charge was Jan Matthys. And once they get control of this, the Catholics lay siege to Munster. So they're at war. John Van Leyden tells Jan Matthys, you know what? God has told me that you are invulnerable and you need to lead the attack. And Jan Matthys goes out there in battle thinking he's impervious and gets killed. And John Van Leyden marries his wife. You're like, wonder how much of that was planned, right? John Van Leyden calls himself the King of the New Jerusalem. This is the New Jerusalem. He's like the new David, and he is a dictator. You have to share everything in common. If you lock your doors, you will be punished. If you refuse to share, you will be punished. We're implementing polygamy. All right, he had 13 wives. One of them offended him. He killed her outright in the square. All right, I mean, he was just a brutal dictator. It's kind of like if you're familiar with Waco, Texas, with David Koresh, right? Those kind of things. Not as crazy as Jim Jones, because he was unhinged and not a Christian. He was a Marxist who just used the church to implement his policies. But like a cult leader. And so what ended up happening is, eventually in 1537, Lutheran and Catholic forces were able to overcome the city. Almost everybody was killed. John Van Leyden and 2 others were tortured, executed, and then hung in cages of St. Lambert's Cathedral in Munster. And to this day, the cathedral in Munster, there are 3 cages hanging up there on the side of giant steeple. And those are the cages they were hung in. And so you can go online, look up St. Lambert's Cathedral cages, and boom, it'll show you the 3 cages where they were hung. So those were radical Anabaptists. The problem is, I kind of liken this, if you remember 9/11. When 9/11 hit, right, immediately afterwards, everybody's like, oh, Muslims are bad and want to kill people, right? So everybody is suspicious of Muslims, and if you find out somebody's a Muslim, you're like, ooh, you're just going to blow things up, right? That is not an accurate caricature. That's not accurate, right? But that's what a lot of people did, because they're like, people blew up the buildings, and who were they? Muslims. Therefore, Muslims must always want to be killing us. Well, that's what happened here. The Anabaptists were responsible for this, so then everybody everywhere is like, oh, Anabaptists, they're the ones that overthrew that city and caused those problems. But 99.9% of the Anabaptists were completely peaceful, but that didn't help their case when you had this go on, all right? So the main Anabaptist that has a lasting legacy is Menno Simons. All of these other Anabaptists are killed, so we do not have a lot of theology from these people because they don't have time to do it, right? We don't have a huge theological textbook from Balthasar Hubmaier because he's executed. We don't have a huge theological treatise from Michael Sadler because he's executed. We have bits and pieces, letters, explanations. So Menno Simons is the main Anabaptist who will not be executed. He's illegal his whole life, but he never gets caught, never gets executed. And of course, the Mennonites get their name from him. So the Mennonites are the clearest remnant of the Anabaptists. Hutterites, the Amish are a split from the Mennonites. There's a few that are still around, but the Mennonites are the main one. So Menno Simons' brother becomes an Anabaptist and is killed at this monastery. Menno Simons is a priest. Everybody loves him. He's the life of the party. He'll out-drink you. He'll carouse. He parties. He loves his priestly life. But then he starts wondering, he's like, why are these people willing to die for what they believe? And he's like, I don't know if I would do that. he starts to question transubstantiation. He's like, maybe I don't think this is really happening. Like, I don't know if I believe this is really the body and blood of Christ. So he has a lot of doubt. And over several years, he eventually leaves the Catholic Church and joins a small Anabaptist group led by a guy named Obi Phillips, who then ends up going back to the Catholic Church, and Menno Simons becomes their leader. So Menno Simons is going to lead this group well into the 1560s, I believe, and dies of just old age. So Menno Simons is the main lasting figure. And so when we look at the Mennonites, they are pacifists. They do not believe that you can defend yourself. You can't fight back. You can't be in the military. They believe you cannot take oaths. They believe in foot washing. They believe foot washing is an important thing you were supposed to do. Trying to think of some other major... They also... Anabaptists are... Everyone I know is Arminian. Right? They are not Calvinist. They are Arminian. So that's a big difference because all of the major reformers are Calvinists. So again, that name's anachronistic. We haven't even talked about Calvin yet. Augustinian, we would say. They believe that God chooses who will be saved. The Arminians believe that you can choose to be saved. Again, Arminius isn't even around yet either. He's not till later, but we use those words anachronistically. So Menno Simons is the main representative that we have of the Anabaptists, and they are persecuted everywhere they go, and they never make a lot of headway. They never become a huge major denomination, right? I mean, today, what do you have? The Mennonites. There's not many of them. So anyway, that's just something to think about. That's our, I'll go ahead and stop this, and then sadly there's 2 lectures for Anabaptists because the first one got interrupted. So I need to do one on John Calvin, and then we'll call this a day. All right.